I say karibuni sana. We are delighted and excited to have you this afternoon. And we will have two speakers this afternoon. Two ladies who have extensive experience in this particular issue of counter trafficking in persons. We have the honor and the pleasure of hosting Winnie Mutevu from HAART Kenya. And we have Miss Juliet Kashanja from the Office of the Chief Justice of the Republic of Kenya. And to moderate our session this afternoon, we have our very own George Masese, advocate, who will be taking us through the session as moderator. So once again, I want to say karibuni sana. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. And I hope that you shall have fruitful deliberations. And right after this particular webinar, ladies and gentlemen, we will be hosting the final submissions, which is the debates, two debates, the JSC representatives and the presidential candidates. And it will be streaming on our Facebook page and on YouTube. So right after this webinar at 4 p.m., we invite you to join us either physically at Riara University or online on our Facebook page, and you can follow the debate and you can send in your questions. And with that, let me not take up too much time because I think this is a very interesting and informative webinar we have this afternoon. I welcome Mr. George Masese to introduce the lovely ladies who will be taking us through this discussion.
Thank you, Chair, and I hope everybody's getting me well. I think since the inception of this virtual one, before you start, you need to ask if you are audible, because you might be speaking to yourself. Either you're muted or maybe the gadget is not compatible. But I believe I have seen Winnie nodding, so that means yes, I'm audible enough. Now, Chair Nairobi, LSK Nairobi, I wish to thank you so much for accepting to allow members actually to know one or two things about trafficking and counter trafficking, and the players and the role of lawyers, that what they should actually, what should be their role in the fight against trafficking, and also giving them tools to understand, even the defense lawyers, when they go to court to maybe defend their cases, or whenever they act as responders or fast responders whenever they see such kind of things like victims of trafficking, and they are able to assist in terms of reporting. Most importantly, I'm having two presenters this afternoon. The first presenter will be Juliet Ruth. I'm going to introduce her briefly before she does her presentation, and the other one is Winnie Mutevu. I just want to point out that this is a very interesting topic, of course, looking at from 2010 when the act was enacted. Ruth is going to tell us more about that. And of course, the progress Kenya has made up to now, and the systems in place in that act, including the Counter Trafficking Advisory Committee, as a system. In that, there's another system we call the Counter Trafficking Trust Fund, and others. So also looking at the issue of protection, the issue of prosecution, the issue of prevention, and the role, of course, of lawyers, most importantly, of lawyers in counter trafficking. So without much ado, let me introduce my first presenter. She's called Ruth Juliet Nyambura Gachanja. So many names. There are two English names and two African names. So Juliet is actually a holder of LLM from Middlesex University, LLB from Moi University, and a diploma of law from KSL. She's an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, and of course, child rights technical advisor and also anti-human trafficking expert. Juliet, as an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, she's a rights and as I've said, anti-human trafficking specialist with the NLM International Children's Rights from Leiden University, and of course, LLM in Minorities, Rights and the Law from Middlesex University, UK. Also, she has, of course, an LLB from University of Moi University. She's a lecturer currently at Kabarak University and also serves as the Child Justice Advisor to the Chief Justice of Kenya. She is a member of NCAJ Standing Committee on the Administration of Justice for Children. She's also championing the work of Love Justice International Kenya chapter, which works to intercept human trafficking through transit border monitoring. Ms. Gajanja also serves as the board chairperson of the African Institute for Children Studies. In the recent past, she chaired the Justice Working Group under the Alliance 8.7 and led the process of developing a justice policy guide on what works to end modern slavery. Ms. Gajanja was the first chairperson of the first advisory committee 2014-2017 on human trafficking established under the Counter Trafficking in Persons, and also executive director of the CRADO, the Children Foundation. I must mention that as the first chair of the first advisory committee, I was lucky to have been mentored as the first vice chair of that committee, and I learned a lot. Actually, I am a crusader of this program, courtesy of Gashanja. So I'm a product of the presenter this afternoon. So with those few remarks, we'll introduce Winnie Mutevu later. Juliet, welcome, and kindly talk to your fellow professionals. Karibu sana.
Good afternoon, everybody, and fellow colleagues, and I think some of my students are also joining. Thank you so much, Chair of LSK Nairobi. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you so much, Mr. Masese, and for the wonderful introduction. Indeed, we have worked together to combat human trafficking, and we will not stop. That's it looks like this is what sometimes I ask myself with my friends, did we ask for it or did the job look for us? And I think this is both a calling and a professional. So I am really delighted to take part in this conversation today, and really it is a conversation that we are going to have. So I hope that it can be interactive. I hope that as colleagues that we can be able to actually use a chat box and have a conversation about human trafficking, because it's actually is happening where we are, not too far away from us as we would like to imagine. So the other day, somebody asked me, is it possible for men to be trafficked? Is it possible for older people to be trafficked? Isn't it only for children? I've also heard people say, well, maybe it's not just, is it really happening in Kenya, or is it the one that we hear when people travel to go and work in the GCC countries, the Gulf countries? And I said, surprisingly, it's not a foreign subject. It's not a foreign topic. But this is a very special opportunity for me, because I think my colleagues, my fellow learned friends, do not have all the tools, especially, or they feel like they're not so much part of this conversation, as we are always looking to the law enforcement to deal with it. So this afternoon, allow me to just take a few of your moments of your time to just have this conversation. So I'm gonna share my screen here. Let's see, I think this is the one. And do let me know if you can see my presentation. And if you cannot, also let me know. Because I think, Chair, Mr. Masese, can you see my presentation? Because then
yes, I can see your presentation.
All right, brilliant. So we'll start, and I hope when it's about time, somebody can just alert me so that I can stop. But this is my hope, that we are going to have a conversation around, the definition of terms, the, push and pull factors, the overview of human trafficking, the legal framework. But before I do that, let us have a bit of reflections. I like doing this because and I would also encourage you, by all means, to use the chat box to share with me your views and also what you're seeing around you pertaining this particular subject. So I'm going to talk about human trafficking generally, and also sort of, and also bring in the issues of children as I go along, because as you see, from the introduction, that children is really where my heart is. So an NGO, and at the end of the presentation, I'm hoping to share this, and it'll have some information that where you can find these reports. So an NGO says that that traffickers, including family members, peers, taxi drivers, intermediary recruiters, exploit over 2,000 children in Kilifi and in Kwale counties for sex trafficking. And we'll start differentiating this. Our National Council on Children's Services, for those of us who do not know this, I'm going to sort of expound a little bit on some of these bodies, says that 17,500 Kenyans are trafficked annually for domestic work, forced labor, commercial sexual exploitation, of which 50% are most likely to be minors. These reports are found within the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, and 8.5% of the children, or 1.3 children, are engaged in child labor. So these are things that are happening in our country, and I hope that it moves you to some kind of action. In last year's TIP is Trafficking in Persons report. It's a report that is information that is gathered by the US TIP office. And they said that the government reported that it actually supported 556 victims of trafficking, of which 275 were exploited in labor, 31 in sex trafficking, 250 in unspecified forms of trafficking. The majority were Kenyans. Others were from other foreign nationals, including South Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. So this is last year's report. And again, in 2020, there's a report here that was given to us that 35,000, that the trafficking victims range from 35 to 40,000, including child sex tourism. And the perpetrators, get this, include our Kenyan government officials, police officers, local authorities, and to some extent some foreign tourists. So I wonder what comes to your mind when you see this kind of statistics. For me, it's happening, number one. Number two is that we need to have a clearer figure about this, and I'm hoping that some of the people who've joined on today can share with us a bit of knowledge on this, especially data. And then I'm wondering, is there enough action around this issue? So some more reflections. Human trafficking really is a collection of crimes. It's bundled crimes. It's not one crime, it is many crimes put together. So it's stealing, for instance, of freedom for profit. That is what some scholars have said, that human trafficking is the business of stealing freedom for purposes of profit. If we think about, the transatlantic trade, slavery, those people were shackled and, they were taken away. And again, it was their freedom and they were exploited constantly. And that was the kind of trafficking or slavery that we saw then. Now, people are trafficked right from their own homes into other people's homes, into others' businesses for profit. So human trafficking in Africa is a 13.1 billion dollar industry, and out of this, 8.9 billion comes from sexual exploitation. So one of the things you notice is that there is a higher number of people who are trafficked in Africa for labor purposes, but the sexual exploitation also quite has a big profit, and this is why we need to fight it, because it is, to some extent, it's profitable, but it's profitable to the wrong people, and it is profitable for the wrong reason. Victims of trafficking yield up to 2,000, sex trafficking yield up to 21,800 each year due to high demand. So as I was saying, forced labor, you have more people, but sexual exploitation seems to generate more profits. So, traffickers use different methods to do this, and to lure people, and I'm going to talk about it. But just for starters, and I will come back again to this definition. What is, when we say people have been trafficked, allow me to just use an imagery here. This is it, this right here, So we recruit people, we transport people, harbor people, and we receive them, or we, for purposes of exploitation, through deceit, fraud, abduction, etc., etc. Then you have child trafficking. So this, as you can see, one of the key important things here that you need to take away is the means through which is used to traffic people. But child trafficking is a little different. And this has been a conversation over the UN over time because of, and this is also within our laws, and I'm going to show you in a bit, because children do not consent. So we cannot necessarily go back and say, how were they trafficked? Did they consent? Did they say yes? Did they say no? Because of that reason, legally speaking, they cannot consent. So we remove the aspect of means. And we say that children can be trafficked for, when we want to show a case of trafficking for children, is recruitment, transportation, harboring for purposes of exploitation. And the UN and the Kenyan laws and our, Trafficking Persons Act, our Children Act says we cannot exhaust the forms of exploitation, because every year there are new ones, and it would be interesting to hear what you have seen. So that amounts to child trafficking. But quickly, what fuels human trafficking? What is it that makes it so, prevalent? So pull factors, push factors. Pull factors is what is drawing people to be victims or to be vulnerable to human trafficking. The push factors, of course, is what is pushing the people to human trafficking. Ignorance is a big one. Poverty is using a very generalized term to say this, but poverty is one of them. Of course, we now go into the nitty-gritties of poverty. What does poverty actually mean? The other reasons, other than this, so the push factors and the pull factors that has been discussed over time, is this a high reward and low risk dynamic. This means that traffickers can expect to make a lot of money with minimal fear of punishment or legal consequence. And it is the second most profitable illegal industry, second to the drug trade. So, ladies and gentlemen, high reward, low risk. All right. The other reason is shown here. The other reason is human trafficking is fueled by the economic principles of supply and demand. And there's quite a number of people who want, cheap clothes, cheap cars, cheap services, cheap products. So what does that mean? Because there's a high demand for cheap labor and all these things, it means we have to hire more people at exploitative rates so that we can actually supply to this demand. So this is the other reason. And finally, is the systematic inequalities, which is really one of the biggest reasons, and the reports show this, the systematic inequalities and disparities, which make certain groups much more vulnerable. So for example, mass displacements, conflicts, climate change, lack of access to education, job opportunities, social norms like harmful cultural practices like child marriage, FGM, extreme families living in extreme poverty. All these are reasons as to why, and as I said, systematic inequalities is one of the biggest reasons why people are actually vulnerable to trafficking. So what's happening in Kenya? Kenya is an origin, a source, and a destination country when it comes to human trafficking. And this is according to the report, as I said, to the US TIP report, meaning that as an origin, we are a sending country. We send, we have people here who are victims of trafficking who go and are trafficked somewhere else. Then you have a transit. We've had several cases where, people are trafficked in Kenya and are passing through Kenya to be trafficked and to be exploited in other countries. And then you have a destination country. I've had cases with the Anti-Trafficking and Child Protection Unit where we're rescuing victims of trafficking from other countries and also within our country, from our country within Kenya. So that is why Kenya is an origin, it's a transit, and it's a destination country. These are just some of the places where they are. So what is it that the state has done? Several things. One is, of course, developed a law, which we're going to be looking at in a minute. Then there is a national plan of action that was launched last year. I hope Veronica Mwangi is here to talk about it. Then you have a national referral mechanism. We have the Anti-Human Trafficking and Child Protection Unit. We have the National Assistance Trust Fund for Victims of Trafficking. This is a body within the Act. The Advisory Committee, which Mr. Masese has talked about a little bit. There's two things here. You can see I'm talking about a trust fund twice. What I forgot to add there is the board, because one is the fund, the other one is the board that actually administers this. And the National Plan of Action has 4 Ps, and we'll highlight that a little bit. So what is our role as advocates? What is it that we ought to do? And this is a question for us as lawyers. I'm going to leave it there you can also, again, use the chat section, which we'll be looking at. So the legal framework starts from the understanding that all of us are born free. And this is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says this, that we are all born free. And that is why human trafficking, as I said, is buying freedom. It's actually exploiting people for their freedom and taking away their freedom. And so this is, as we go ahead to discuss this and as we go ahead to think through this, I want us to remember, and also as lawyers, really, when we go to court, when we are defending victims of trafficking, and I'll already say this to answer the question I just asked, what is my role? I'm hoping that a lot of us will take up the role of being advocates for victims of trafficking, because we really need to defend their rights. So the law on human trafficking finds its basis under the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, famously known as UNCTOC. And this law created several things to be able to combat human trafficking and smuggling in persons. So I'll just jump into the protocols. So the protocols that were created under the UNCTOC was the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and girls. A lot of women and children. A lot of people say, why women and children? I'm hoping that we can be debated later on. Protocol against smuggling and protocol against illicit manufacturing of trafficking in firearms and the rest. So these 3 protocols are the protocols that enhance the UNCTOC. So the first one is really where our concern is. And the protocol to prevent, suppress trafficking in persons, what it did for the fight against human trafficking was that it defined human trafficking. It provided this interlocking tools, which is protection, prosecution, and prevention as a method to combating trafficking. The other one that is really important is protection of victims, because you realize, because it is a revolving door, human trafficking, because you said it's many crimes put together, and it's sort of a revolving door. And you can easily, as a victim of trafficking, leave one place and go to another and get out and still go back to the trafficking. Protection of victims is very, very key, so that we do not have the victims being re-trafficked. And then finally, the other important thing that the protocol gave us, it's also famously called as the Palermo Protocol, is cooperation among actors. I'm going to just highlight a little bit of this other one. So the protocol on human trafficking and the other one on smuggling really talks about smuggling of migrants. And a lot of sometimes we forget, or people tend to confuse the two, where there's smuggled migrants and then there is victims of trafficking. Now, one is, both of them are in one way or another, they are all exploited. One is exploited so that they can be able to cross the border, that is the smuggled person, but the other one is exploited by a trafficker continuously so that the trafficker can actually benefit for profit. So what is the obligation of the state according to this? And I ask this question here so that when I start looking at the Counter-Trafficking Persons Act, we can see what is expected of the state when it comes to fighting human trafficking, and see where, as lawyers, we can actually ask the state to do something. So the obligation of the state is, there are three key obligations, and these are borrowed from the UNCTAD. So number one is the obligation on criminalization and investigation and punishment of trafficking. The second one is the obligation of state parties towards victim protection and support. And the third one is to prevent trafficking by addressing factors that increase vulnerability of persons and bilateral and multilateral cooperation to discourage the demand that fosters all forms of exploitations of persons. I put this here because as lawyers as well, we understand what the Constitution expects of us when it says that, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights binds all persons. And again, going back to the Constitution, Article 2, 5, and 6 as well allows us to use international law that we have signed on to as binding in Kenya. So these are sort of our requirements. These are the requirements that we are required by international law that we have signed on to. So it's important for us to ask ourselves, what is it that we will do about that? So what is our law? What does the law here say? In Kenya, we have several laws that deal with human trafficking. One, we have the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act. That's the key law. I request you to have a look at it. The second one is the Children Act. We have the Sexual Offences Act. We have the Penal Code. We have many other laws because, as I said, remember that human trafficking is a series of crimes and not just one. So for almost every crime, you have a law. So for instance, you have the Kenya Citizenship and Immigration Act. We have the which other one? We have Victim Protection Act, Penal Code, Witness Protection Act. We have, Prevention, Protection, and Assistance to IDPs and Affected Communities Act. We have very many laws that actually talk about this. The ones I have put here are laws that actually look at the victim and look at the perpetrator and address the issues. So we have the Witness Protection Act. This is to enhance protection, of course, for witnesses and for victims. The Employment Act, which is the one that deals with issues of forced labor and child labor. We have the Victim Protection Act, again, that comes in to protect and offer measures of protection for victims of crimes. And we have the Kenya Citizenship and Immigration Act, which talks about, prohibited immigrants. What do we do with smuggled persons? So the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act defines human trafficking, and it has several definitions, and this is where we need to pay close attention. Number one is Section 3, which talks about trafficking, as I defined it earlier, the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons or a child for purposes of exploitation. And remember, we said that the exploitation bit is extensive. Section 3.4 defines the territorial scope, which may be committed internally within the borders of Kenya or internationally across the borders of Kenya. All this, they carry an offense, penalty rather, of imprisonment for life. 30 years or a fine of 30 million, or both, and subsequent conviction, imprisonment for life. The term exploitation, please let us remember this, that there is no end to it, because this keeps changing, and especially even in the digital era, it keeps changing all the time. So as you can see, it's called the 2010 Act. What is interesting when you look at case law, it didn't come into effect until 2012 for reasons best known to, I think, our country. our government. So child trafficking is also redefined and is defined within the law. And again, remember the aspect of consent. Because a child cannot consent, then the act of trafficking for children removes the aspect of consent. So the recruitment of children or transportation of children, transfer of children, harboring of a child or receipt of a child for purposes of exploitation. So that is it. The other one that we need to take keen note of is section 4, which talks about acts that promote child trafficking, which include adoption, fostering, offering up a child for guardianship for purposes of trafficking. And remember, trafficking is the other forms of exploitation. And it is important for us to note the language that is used here in the law, that it is acts that promote child trafficking. So we are not saying that adoption is trafficking. We're not saying that guardianship is trafficking, but can they be used for trafficking? Certainly. There are other sections, just, so that I can allow questions. There are other sections that are here is section 4. Again, as I said, criminalizes acts that, foster or encourage trafficking of children. Then there is acts like leasing or occupying, permitting occupation of any premises. These are all for purposes of trafficking of persons. This here is also a crime against according to the CTIP. Also fraud, using fraud to get documents. And this is a close one to smuggling of persons. And that is why our law enforcement and, immigration, lawyers, police need to be very careful, because when somebody gets fraudulently acquires documents for purposes of trafficking of a person or assisting in the same, the law envisions this as a crime. Other criminal activities include aiding and abetting of persons to exit or entry of persons. Others include interference with travel documents of another person. And others include causing a victim of trafficking permanent or life-threatening bodily harm. So there are various crimes that are and offenses that are seen in the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act. The other part that is really critical of this law is the victim support. And this was really the benefit of having a specific law on counter-trafficking in persons. And this is it, the victim support area. So, and Winnie will be talking a little bit about that. And so restitution for victims of trafficking, immunity from prosecution. We realize that sometimes victims of trafficking will do something because, they're trying to run away. They might beat somebody, which is assault. They might break things. They might even steal things. And these are all, they are all crimes, but they were doing this as victims of trafficking as they are trying to escape from the place they find themselves. So Section 14 guarantees them immunity for these offenses. I would like to see an advocate trying to defend this in court. The other one is Section 15, which provides support and protection for victims by requiring the ministry that is responsible for gender and children services to formulate plans for this, and hence the national referral mechanism, the national plan of action, and the various other documents. I hope the current chairperson, Veronica Mwangi, is actually here in this meeting to tell us a little bit more about what the government is doing. So Section 15 is very, very critical. Section 16 talks about exempting them from payment or filing fees. And Section 22 is one of the most critical bodies, which is the National Assistance Trust Fund for Victims of Trafficking. Remember, we've said that there's so many, these are the factors that we talked about that draw people to be vulnerable to trafficking, push people to be vulnerable. This trust fund is meant to support these victims so that they are not finding themselves back as victims of trafficking. Then we have the bodies that are established within the Trafficking in Persons Act, Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act, and this is one of them, the Section 19, which is the advisory committee, which is what Mr. Masese said, that I chaired the first advisory committee, he chaired the second one, current one, is chaired by Veronica Mwangi. And then we have the secretariat, that is headed by the Directorate of Children's Services, which actually works together with the advisory committee to combat trafficking in Kenya. So the functions include, there are many, but really it is to guide the country in combating human trafficking by formulating policies, coordinating activities, evaluating Kenya's progress and efforts towards prevention, protection, and prosecution of human trafficking in Kenya. So we can talk about some of the successes as we go along. So this trust fund for me is one of the most critical parts of this law, because then it really ensures that we are dealing with the vulnerabilities of people so that they are not trafficked. And if you remember, when I talked about our obligations as a state, it addresses some of those obligations. So the establishment of this fund it's spearheaded by a board of trustees, which is in existence. The monies come from various areas. So there is a proceeds of crime, which is why I encourage that immediately somebody has been found to be guilty of human trafficking, that the state should take away their proceeds and profits immediately. Then income generated activities by board members, and of course donations. And this fund, what it can do is that it can be used to support victims of trafficking, and support them in every kind of way possible. And I hope that somebody's heard that they can tell us. Now, human trafficking is linked to other crimes, as I said, and I will not belabor on this point so much, but some of them are here. For instance, the child sex tourism, linked to the Sexual Offences Act. So child sex tourism as defined within the Act, meaning that somebody, a perpetrator, can be found culpable or, held criminal liable for child sex tourism on one hand as count one, and human and child trafficking, for instance, for purposes of sexual tourism, child sexual tourism, as count two. The other one is child prostitution, child pornography, and this, of course, is enhanced by the Computer Misuse and Cybercrime Act and the current Children Act, various other laws, and child marriage as well can be linked to all this, because it's interesting. We are now seeing from where I sit, I see a lot of cases where children are married off. Then when the perpetrator is arrested, they are taken across the border. The child is taken across the border, for instance, whether it's a foreign border or internal border, and that is where they're hidden in other countries or places. So what are the elements of trafficking? And I think this, for us as lawyers, this is what, and of course police officers, is what is really important. It's split into two. The act itself is split into two. One is the offense must include, any of the following. So recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring. The second one, for human trafficking adults, must contain the use of force, threats, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse, or vulnerability, giving or receiving of others. And Geoffrey Mutemi's case will tell you this. The other act is, of course, the mens rea element, which we must not necessarily show that the exploitation happened, but the intention to exploit must come out in a case. All right. So, and this is the most difficult to prove. So for those of us who are advocates for perpetrators, this is where, this is where we really hammer the prosecution, is ask, can you prove, really? Can we show that indeed the intention to prosecute, to exploit was met? But exploitation need not have happened and need not have occurred for us to be successful in this case. But the intention has to be very clear. And remember that exploitation in the law is a non-exhaustive list. So I encourage you to look at these particular cases and for trafficking within Kenya, there are many more, which I'd be more than to share. But, so in one case, the trafficking a child for the purposes of sexual exploitation can be widely interpreted. This is the Judge Hezron Mwakio case. That is what the court said. And then the second one, the Sheikh Ali Samoja, the principle established here was that to prove the charge of organizing to travel to facilitate a sexual offense against a child, it must be shown beyond reasonable doubt that the underlying motive or intention of the dispatcher of the child was to facilitate the offense. So intention is really critical when it comes to these matters. I'm going to sort of stop there, and then I can come back to some of these recommendations, but really I will stop there to allow my colleague to actually carry on from there. And then I can, given a chance, we'll come back and talk about some of these recommendations that I have in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet, for that presentation. I know we are running out of time. This is something so dear to you, so I know when you have time, you like talking about it. Allow me to bring in Winnie. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Judge.
All right, thank you. Let me introduce to you Winnie Mutefu. Winnie Mutefu is the Advocacy, Partnership and Development Manager at HART. She'll tell us exactly what HART is. HAART, Kenya, with over a decade of experience in program management, advocacy and partnership development in the counter-trafficking spaces. She has trained government officials, community leaders, and CSO members in Kenya and across Africa. She is a co-author and a contributor in developing vital training materials for the frontline workers, including the standard operating procedures for investigating and prosecuting trafficking in persons in Kenya. She's a member of the technical working group reviewing the Trafficking in Persons Act 2010 and a recipient of the Pauline Jaricot Award for her dedicated efforts in combating human trafficking. Winnie, thank you so much for this wonderful achievement in your life. And the lawyers, I know you may
Thank you very much, Judge. Yeah, it's shared. My name is Winnie and I work for HART Kenya. HART in full, it's awareness against human trafficking. I'll also go ahead and make my presentation. I see we don't have much time, so I'll try and take as minimal time as possible. Thank you, Juliet, for actually setting the scene and being able to actually also look more into the legal aspects. I'll be focusing more on what we do as CSOs in this sector. And feel free to share your questions, your comments through the chat box. I'll be happy to be able to respond after the presentation. So please confirm you can see my screen.
Yes, I can see your screen, and I hope everybody.
Yeah, and I hope I'm also audible because I'm slowly losing you, George. So I hope it's not my network, but rather yours. Yeah, okay. So yeah, I'll go ahead.
It is, should be my network.
Okay, okay. So I'll start my presentation with playing a short video and then we can proceed.
Dreams are special. We all have them. My dream is to become a lawyer, maybe a doctor, or even the president. I have the freedom to dream, but unfortunately, others don't. She was promised to be a teacher. He was promised a well-paying job. They were recruited and exploited. Victims of human trafficking can come from anywhere, and sometimes they are not even aware they are victims. Men, women, boys and girls are trafficked into forced labor and sex work, sold and bought like property. Prevention is key. We all need to know the signs. Globally, the majority of trafficking victims are between 18 and 24 years of age. An estimated 1.2 million children are trafficked each year. 95% of victims experience physical or sexual violence during trafficking. We need your help to fight against human trafficking so that we can all chase our dreams.
So for such materials, you're able to find more materials on what HAT does on our YouTube pages, on our website, you're able to find more materials about human trafficking. So as HAT Kenya, our mandate fairly focuses on being able to counter human trafficking. And we do our work around the 4 areas as recommended by the UN, where we have programming around protection work, and we get support victims of human trafficking based on their needs. And we also do offer shelter services for girls and women who've been trafficked. Within the prevention component, we do offer trainings as well as awareness, creating forums to the communities, to schools. We do have safeguarding clubs. We do also have awareness and training forums for first responders, looking at the police, the chiefs, the faith-based organizations, essentially anyone who, once you come across a case of trafficking, you'll think of reporting to them. And we do then support the prosecution component, where we're able to support the law enforcement or DPP to be able to actually prosecute trafficking cases. And then we are members of different networks within the country, across the globe, to ensure then we're able to amplify the impact of our work. We've been in existence for more than 13 years now and been able to reach one-on-one individuals through our community workshops, 100,000 people, and been able to support more than 1,000 survivors. So what I'll be able to share with you today is based on our experience in the last 10 plus years, and what we've been able to learn. So our approach, we are a grassroots organization where we do operate in Kenya, but then we're able to have a national access to different departments, stakeholders, looking at the government, CSOs, as well as different UN agencies, but then also being able to have our work being shared across the globe, looking at the different UN platforms, as well as different global networks. So for today, I'll focus only on 2 areas. We're looking at the protection component as well as the prosecution component. So when it comes to what we've been able to hear from what Juliet was sharing, so we'll have identification of victims of human trafficking, and then it's a question of what happens once they're identified. So based on our programming, we do have 2 departments, one focusing on outreach care, where we're able to support survivors within their communities, and for the shelter, for those who are not able to go to their homes for one reason or the other, then we offer that support within the country. And so the services that are available, we're able to support law enforcement with rescue, as well as identification of victims of human trafficking. We're able to offer basic needs. This is always depending on what the needs are, but more critical is looking at psychosocial support as well as medical support. And sometimes we are able to offer psychiatric care, where it's now being able to look into admission or medical care when it comes to psychological needs. We do offer legal aid. We do offer support with education, one for victims of human trafficking, as well as dependents of survivors of human trafficking. We do also look into economic empowerment, where the options look like business startups, upskilling, going back to school, or able to support them to acquire employment. And some of the people who are in foreign countries or they we need to go back home, we're able to look into how we can support with repatriation, one of the most expensive areas. So always dependent on available resources. But then overall, the goal is to look into how do we reintegrate survivors back into their communities. And just a disclaimer on the language I'll be using. In the CSO sector, we try and use more enabling language, hence the reason I'll be using majorly survivors. However, the legal term is victims of human trafficking, just in case any of you get confused. So it comes to the prosecution component, which is what I got to focus more on for today's conversation. As an organization, we were able to develop as well as release a legal handbook, which is focusing on first responders and just looking into frontline workers for institutions that actually don't have advocates or lawyers, who is able to help them to identify legal needs for people that they're working with, and how do we journey with them through the criminal justice system. So the legal handbook is available on our website, and also we do have physical copies. Whoever might be keen or interested in the information that is available. And we do offer legal clinics for survivors. So this is in group sessions. We're able to train survivors in different components, looking into their rights, what is the criminal justice system, how does it support them, and also how can they be able to get support through the process, either criminal or looking into the civil aspects. And we do have then advocates who get to journey with survivors going through the court process for those who are willing to proceed, or those who their cases are either way instituted through the different government departments that we get to work with, looking into the DCI or different police stations that get to have different cases going to court. So at the moment, we do have a success of having 13 prosecutions, and where we are having 52 survivors actually following up on their cases. So some of the challenges we've been able to experience in this process is a general lack of awareness by VOTs looking into victims of human trafficking on their rights, as well as an understanding of the legal proceedings. I think there's someone who was mentioning in a meeting I was at 2 weeks ago, where when it comes to going to court or having to work with the police, or just overall when you hear about the criminal justice system, many of us will evade it unless we really must engage with them. It's just like the hospitals. If you don't have to go to hospital, you are happy just staying at home. Just looking into how do we have then VOTs being aware of this process and making sure that it's also more friendly for them to be able to actually participate, and us being able to have them have access to justice. I think that the challenge overall, I think it's across all the cases, always having long court processes. Sometimes we have survivors who start this process when they're minors, they become adults, they feel like they've lost a lot of their lives because they're being held in shelters or different centers. At this point, as an adult, they can be able to decide to let go of the cases. And we've had some cases going cold because of survivors opting not to proceed with the processes. One of them being the challenge of the cases always being long. But then another challenge with the delayed process, we've had survivors now seeking alternatives to accessing to justice. And I think the one of them is not actually using the formal processes. Most of them actually opting to go for witchcraft because they feel like, I lost a lot. Someone scammed me, they took my funds, someone exploited me, nothing has been done. So how can I be able to actually find ways for me to have access to my, what they term as their justice? Some of them now utilizing processes like witchcraft. And then I think there's overall a minimal or just lack of measures being put in place to ensure then that we have enough security ensured for witnesses, which most of the time is looking at the survivors of human trafficking, having specialized CSOs also being offered security when they're managing some high-level cases, as well as any other concerned parties. So we've had a breach in these processes where sometimes you'll go to some courts and actually details of the CSOs being mentioned out loud, and then you have now different people following up, and these poses security threats then to the CSOs or other parties who are involved in these processes. But then also looking into the movement in and out of courts, you'll sometimes have the actual traffickers showing up in court. It's a question of how do we ensure that the movement in and out of courts is being ensured, and also looking into the councils, how do they communicate to the prosecutors, to the IOs, to the magistrates, or sometimes the judges, what needs to be done to ensure that when we have very sensitive cases, then their security is always being ensured from the beginning, from when we're starting to do the planning and looking into the different risks that might manifest in the different cases. The other challenge that we're more or less witnessing is misidentification of cases, which either leads to acquittal because you don't have enough evidence to actually use the Trafficking in Persons Act, or have now lesser charges being accorded to different situations, or having the cases going cold. And I think it's also one of those things where we are very critical on being able to communicate the difference between trafficking in persons and looking into also smuggling, because these are the two areas where we have a lot of confusion on what is what and what should be used when you're going to court to look into how then survivors can be able to have access to justice. And when it comes to smuggling, most of the time it's a deportation for the individuals who are within the country illegally. The other area is just looking into the Trafficking in Persons Act, which was being highlighted by Juliet. When it comes to its popularity, it's not that high among the criminal justice actors, hence meaning it's not highly used when it comes to when we are preferring charges. It's not what is people are going for first. We'll find them using different acts. The Children's Act, we look into the Sexual Offences Act. Other acts are being used to find the preferred charges, and then we end up really looking into if we were able to have survivors being able to really enjoy the privileges that come with us using the act, that gets lost, because with the act it also gets to provide different measures being made available for survivors being able to actually get compensated for what they went through. Just the last two, I think, is just looking into overall the complexity of the crime, which makes it challenging to investigate and charge through the act. So looking at what Juliet was sharing, there is the act, there is the means, and also not being able to look into what is the purpose. So being able to have then the investigating officer going back beyond just looking into at the point of rescue, what was the individual going through, but being able to walk back on actually how did you get here, which is what helps us being able to actually identify an individual as being either trafficked or not, or being able to have gone through different violations. And I think the last one is just looking into sometimes the whole criminal justice process. When we have individuals who get to interact with survivors who've not been trained on trauma-informed processes, then we have a lot of re-traumatization taking place from the get-go, from the rescues, from when they're being cross-examined in court, even when they're being repatriated or integrated back into the communities. We've seen a lot of re-traumatization, and it's a question of how do we prevent this from happening, for us to be able to have more cooperation from survivors, but also us being able to support them, instead of this being a process where it really creates more challenges for them, but also for it to become a healing process in these processes they try to more or less access their justice. I think we've been able to see some good practices within this area, and is having the availability of specialized courts that get to focus on trafficking cases. So we do have the Kahawa Law Court that looks into trans-organized cases when it comes to trafficking. We do have Shanzu, we do have the one at the airport, JKIA, and also looking into what is being done at Makadara as well as Kibera. So we do have some magistrates who've really been able to also focus more on this issue, and we see how they get to manage the cases being quite different compared to magistrates who are not familiar with these situations. But also looking into overall, when you have the investigating officers, the prosecutors, the more they're informed on the issue of trafficking, or the more they're also aware on the victims being victims of human trafficking, we've seen the cases being managed way much better compared to when the information was not made available. And I think the other area is when we have legal counsel. Because of trafficking being a criminal act, we do have the people who get to represent then the victims being the prosecutors. But then when you have availability of legal counsel who comes in excellent to be able to support the process, we've seen this ensuring that we minimize postponement of the cases, because we have someone who is actually advocating and pushing more to have the cases not being delayed, but also being able to also advocate for the rights of the victims throughout the whole process. So just being able to look into how do we have this present or this available across when it comes to cases of victims of human trafficking, but also having a legal counsel being available. They're able to also prepare the survivors before they go to court, making them understand what happens pre, during, and post-trial, but also being able to journey with them. We are able to also look into how do we establish trust? Because when you're looking into victims of human trafficking, for them to have gone what they went through, most of them, their trust was violated. And so coming back into these processes is looking into how do we ensure that in everything that we are doing, our goal is being able to instill trust, and being able to also ensure their security and their comfort in all the different processes. And I think lastly, when it comes to also some of the good practices, is being able to see a lot of multi-agency engagement when it comes to specialized organizations being engaged. The investigating officers, the ODPP, really working together to look into how best can we support the different survivors and the different cases for us to be able to actually see that we're able to have a positive outcome. So for my last slide is just being able to share some recommendations, and is looking into how do we have trauma-informed approaches across all the different processes that are involved within the criminal justice process, because we have different actors being involved, but how do we ensure that they are informed on how does trauma manifest, how best do we then get support survivors throughout the different processes, that we don't end up being the ones who cause more harm by doing our day-to-day work. The other thing is just looking into working with service providers and specialized organizations for comprehensive care for VOTs, because some of them require support in different spaces, might be medical, might be financial, and some of them it's basic things on how do I even join an online process that is a court process that is actually taking place online, who is being able to journey with them from the beginning to the end when we have different actors moving in and out of their cases. But I think also just looking into the manifestation of trafficking, it's changing day in, day out, and it's looking into how do you also keep abreast with what is happening, because the other challenge is people choosing to always go back to the history on what they know, instead of looking into with whatever is manifesting, does it actually qualify with what we'd be calling human trafficking. And some examples is looking into cyber crimes. How are we able to manage these cases when it's trafficking being involved, and also looking into always ensuring that victims are always prepared for court. With this missing out, we end up actually having more challenges compared to when we have survivors who are showing up when they've been prepared for the process. And I think just a call for action, looking into the members who are joining us today. If we are happy and willing to offer support, I think we need more lawyers and more advocates being able to actually support survivors to being able to maneuver through the criminal justice system. But I think now this is a personal recommendation for everyone on this call. If you choose to go through this route, when it comes to looking into working with victims who've been trafficked, many of them have gone through different traumatic situations, and we have challenges of vicarious trauma, and it's a question of how do we also look into our own well-being, being able to also really have access to sometimes debrief sessions, but just being able to have a proper system for your self-care, because doing this work can actually be very detrimental for the service providers if not well taken care of. And I would end my presentation there. Thank you very much, George, and everyone for listening.
Thank you, Winnie, for that wonderful presentation. I think for the lawyers now who are on the platform, you can see the opportunities that are arising out of this presentation in terms of assisting or working closely with NGOs, in terms of prosecuting some of these cases, training opportunities available, and developing materials. If you can act as a consultant for these NGOs, at least there are opportunities that are rising for lawyers, and mostly for young lawyers. I can see Enrica Council, you've raised your hand. I'm going to give you an opportunity to say something. I wanted to ask if the chair, current chair of the Counter-Trafficking Personal Advisory Committee is in this platform. Veronica? Okay, if Veronica is not there, then we are going to do, we have two sessions that I want us to run very quickly. One, we have question and answers, which I want to refer to specific presenters. And then I'll maybe give 2 or 3 colleagues to, if they can be able really to ask questions on the platform. On the first one, I think it goes to Juliet's chair. This is from Mercy Kireidi. She was talking about a reflection on missing children. And our worry was there was an upsurge, or rather an upsurge of missing children post-COVID. What is your take from where you sit? What do What do you advise or what do you say about that? The other one is also for the chair. You talked briefly on the national referral mechanism and also the trust fund under the Act. This is from Christine Njagi. Yeah, maybe let's deal with those two, Juliet, quickly, and then we'll go to Winnie
right.
if there's any question for you. Yes.
All right, thank you so much. And Winnie, that was amazing. I have to apologize, Mr. Masasa, because I'm told that we speak very fast. So we will. I hope the recording is made available so that we can listen. And I want to hope that for those of us who are lawyers in practice and would like to continue supporting the victims, that Winnie and Hart would be very gracious to have a training for us, because lawyers and trauma-informed are diverse words or law and trauma is diverse words, but I think a training would be definitely very helpful indeed. Mercy, now when I started talking, I said human trafficking is a series of crimes, and the missing children, the stealing of children, abduction of children, all of it easily can amount to human trafficking. And indeed, we can invite experts who are also dealing with issues of missing children to tell us if there was a form of exploitation that was also seen from the children who were rescued, and also are we taking a different approach to prosecuting these matters, because that is where the game changer is in how we prosecute them. And if these perpetrators, when we arrest them, then are we able to also go for the organized criminal networks that are actually conducting these activities, because that is where the difference is between stealing a child and child abduction and trafficking, because of the organized crime aspect of human trafficking. So I think my advice there would be to pursue the proper prosecution of these particular cases, and so that we can see how to best curb this from a criminal perspective, because there are many ways of actually dealing with human trafficking other than just the criminal perspective. The other question that was asked is about the NRM and the trust fund. So the trust fund, I am told that the trust fund is actually operational. And the current regime, there is the policies, the policy documents were created and drafted, accepted, and the trust fund and the trust fund board is there, and it does support victims of trafficking. So I think it is a matter of writing to them. For judges and magistrates as well, or the court officials who are here and they want to, I think once you make an order for the victim to be supported through the fund, then the fund will have to adhere to the rules that have been provided by the court. And that is what I would propose. Instead of waiting for the fund or the board to come to you, I think it's a matter of also just good practice to see how to best link the two. But the fund is there, it is managed and again supported by the Directorate of Children's Services specifically. There is a department on anti-human trafficking, and that is the department that is supporting both the board and the fund, both the advisory committee and the board, to be able to run the fund. The national referral mechanism. This is I don't know if I'll actually want to ask Winnie because she's on the ground, and all the NGOs here, if we have had a chance to utilize the NRM, because it's a referral pathway. It provides a pathway to be able to refer victims for support, and also to make sure that we don't drop the victims and they become victims of re-trafficking or any other form of abuse or trauma or re-traumatization. So that is what the national referral mechanism is. There is a question, Mr. Masasa, if you allow me, from Felicia that asks about the children from Tanzania who are children living with disabilities. Indeed, the first one, she says, does the issue of trafficking cover children with disabilities? Yes, it does. And the thing about children and child protection is that it's not the rights of children are broadly covered in this country, from the Constitution, the Children Act, and the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act and all these places. So we are able to protect children, and those are the protection measures that are there. They are all covered within the Children Act, and they're very specific to the children. So my advice, first of all, is we need to take the children and put them in a safe place. We need to take care of the children. Sometimes we want to react quickly and prosecute and everything, but we need to take care of these children. Secondly, because the children are from Tanzania, especially the ones that I am aware of as well, and I know there are some also from Kenya, but we need to have a conversation, government-to-government conversation. If the conversation doesn't work, another form of conversations is actually through the courts. One of the cases I wanted to show you was, for instance, a case that was taken to the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and the Welfare of Children against, there was one against Senegal, where the Committee of Experts actually said that Senegal as a country is not doing enough to deal with cases of child beggars and exploitation of children through this manner. So this is one of the ways that which, as advocates, actually we can do this, is file matters against Kenya, against these countries, Uganda, Tanzania, through the human rights frameworks that we have in Africa. So the African Commission on Human People's Rights and the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and the Welfare of the Child are good places to start having those conversations at that higher level. So we first need to remove the children from the streets and offer them the relevant protection, and then prosecute. Together, because I also work with NGOs and I champion the work of Love Justice International, it would be interesting to see how we able to achieve and find the cartels who are putting our children on the streets to actually beg, and can we be able to prosecute them together? Of course, the prosecution is one that does the work of prosecution, but can we be able to support this kind of high-level prosecution? For me, it's a challenge to us as advocates and to us as NGOs that are actually working around this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet. I think the question you answered, the last one, I wanted to give Winnie to tell us exactly these children in Nairobi. You see, for me, when I'm passing in Nairobi and I see those children, what comes into my mind is they're just beggars. But from you yourself, Winnie, what do you see, and what do you conclude when you see them there? Maybe you can talk briefly about it. Juliet has talked about it, but you can also tell us from your practical aspect. What do you see?
So I think there are different things. One, you are able to tell when someone is begging, and actually sometimes you're able to tell when they're being accompanied by someone else. So you're able to tell when it's a family member or a family that is actually using this as a means for them to make an income. And sometimes you're able to tell the difference when it's someone actually who is being forced to be in the street. Sometimes I was just looking into even how they're dressed. Physically, some of them actually have injuries. So you're able to tell the difference from one who is actually just doing this. I think even seen children who are even selling sweets in the streets. So sometimes you can be able to tell the difference. Other times you can't. But then the reality is, when it comes to offering support to children or even adults with disabilities, it immediately requires more resources. And even looking into our infrastructures, does this even support that to be possible? And the fact that you're not able to offer support generally to victims of trafficking overall, it's a question of how much more is required from the different stakeholders. Because in as much as I'll see a potential, I'll call them a potential VOT in the streets, I'm not able to take action until I report to the necessary to the authorities, looking at the DCS or the police, for them to actually be able to do the rescue. And when this is done, it's a question of how are the cases being managed. And I think a question of resources has made it difficult for them to actually offer the right services, because it's a question of where will you take them. And I think from different stakeholders meetings, it's been shared that sometimes even when you do the rescues, you even lack shelters to put these children. So then sometimes they are being left in the streets, not because they need to be there, but it's because there really ain't enough resources to be able to support them. With the fact that we have many of them coming in and leaving the country more regularly than it should be happening.
Thank you, Winnie. Julia talked about lawyers need to come out and sue the government, participate in all activities that can actually ensure that human trafficking as a vice is dealt with. And of course, we can't eliminate it completely, but we have to reduce it. We have to work very hard to ensure that we reduce that vice in society. Remember, again, the other thing is that we have this internal human trafficking and international. So internally, those mates you have, so many lawyers have mates in their houses, and they think like they are not victims of, or rather culprits of human trafficking. You are actually, because sometimes those are underage, they can't make decisions, they are doing hard work. Some of them are sleeping at midnight, waking up at 4. So that is part of what we say internal human trafficking. And I think next time Juliet and Winnie will talk about it. Juliet is the first, for this act to have come into force, Juliet took the PS and the ministry to court. And that is how this act came into operation. Some of us are beneficiaries of efforts. And that is why she was actually saying you need to come out and participate in this as lawyers. I've seen 2 hands. I see the Secretariat is trying to warn me that time is up, but I need to give one of the practitioners in this area, Enrica Dulo, a chance to speak. Enrica, I don't know whether you can unmute yourself and ask the question you wanted to ask or make your contribution.
Virtually?
Yeah, we can see you, can hear you.
Yes, in another life, I worked with Juliet in counter-trafficking in persons. I have several questions and comments. One, when it comes to the issue of the street children, especially the ones in Nairobi, whom we generally know are from Tanzania, I wouldn't put the issue of where to put the children if they're rounded up, I wouldn't put it at the forefront. I think at the forefront should be how to get the adults who traffic these children and successfully prosecute them. And then remember that we have a fund that's operational. So if we have a fund that's operational, then why should we claim that we don't know where to put them? Because if the children are rounded up where the adults who traffic them are being prosecuted after their evidence has been taken, which can be through a witness statement, and most of them are from Tanzania, they can be and should be repatriated immediately so as not to cost us more. Secondly, when I look at the annual human trafficking report that's produced by the US government, for the longest time, Juliet, I think since Kenya, I think since Kenya passed the act, we've remained on tier 2 watch list. Why are we on tier 2 watch list year in, year out? What is it that we're not doing? We should move from tier 2 watch list to at least tier 2 or tier 1. So there's something that we are not doing. Tier 2 watch list is not good because Kenya has been flagged as a source, transit, and destination country for human trafficking. So as practitioners, and I hold the government more in responsibility because they are the ones tasked with the tripartite typology of obligations to protect, respect, and promote. So why are we still 14 years down the line? Why are we still on tier 2 watch list? Then thirdly, Juliet, you mentioned certain acts or acts of parliament that are cross-cutting on trafficking, which is very good. I've done a lot of surrogacy with you, Juliet, and that is something that you need to take note of because there was an element or fear of trafficking, which is what led to having the moratorium on international adoption. The surrogacy bill as it is, the assisted reproductive technologies bill as it is, has proposed that the product of IVF, which is a child, should be passed to the intended parent through an agreement. That brings in an element of putting these helpless children to trafficking. So if you're working in the sphere of trafficking, you need to be part and parcel of the discussions that take place when we discuss the assisted reproductive technologies bill. Because I tell people the product of ART, the product of IVF is a child. So the rights of the child should be central and should be key in that act, not reproductive health rights, actually. Reproductive health rights, if you ask me, should be secondary. The best interest of the child should be the paramount one and should be the key right that we are promoting. Then lastly, before I forget, this has gone off. If it comes to me, I will, yes. Sometime last year, I handled a case of a minor who'd been charged with possession at a different court. But when I took his details and went digging into his background, he was a victim of child trafficking in Kenya. And that desperation now led him to the streets, and as a means of survival, then he committed an offense and was charged. I remember calling the Tanzanian embassy and informing them that I have a minor I'm representing and he's from your country, blah, blah, blah. And the response I got was not very good. They told me they will not get themselves involved, and once the case is finished, if the boy wants their help, then I should contact them so that they assist the boy. And I found that very disheartening for an embassy that's not concerned about the welfare of its citizens. So I think we need to do more. And because we've identified that a lot of children who are being trafficked are from Tanzania, we need to do more with that particular neighbor and their representative in Kenya. Then lastly, a lot of people do not understand the difference between smuggling and trafficking. Adults who are smuggled, consent is there. They know what is happening and they even give money because they want to be taken across the seas. Adults who are trafficked do not know, and they don't spend, often they don't spend their money, they're exploited because it's the trafficker who benefits. So as you train and as we have more of these sessions, we need to be clear and share with people the thin line or the characteristics and the difference between smuggling and trafficking. Trafficking is totally an offense, both and mainly on the trafficker. Whereas smuggling, both the smuggler and the person who agreed to be smuggled have committed an offense. Sometimes I watch on news when people have been arrested, not Kenyan nationals, obviously either from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti. They're using Kenya as a transit to South Africa. Are they victims? Are they victims of trafficking, or have they been smuggled even as they're arrested and being prosecuted? And with that, I end my comments. Asante sana. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrica. What you didn't tell them is that you're my classmate.
Yes, yes.
So
Uni, yes.
All right, thank you so much, Enrica, for that, and I'm happy for the work you're doing.
Juliet and I were actually involved in the development of what you now have as an act, Counter Trafficking Persons Act.
Thank you so much. Before I give Juliet to react to that, I think I saw Tandy raising up her hand. We are running out of time. I'm sure we were supposed to finish at 3. Now we are going to 3:30. We spent 10 minutes. Tandy, can you spend maybe a minute? Then we give it back to the presenters to react to whatever the comments.
Yes, thank you so much. This is Pauline Kedogo Anubi. I'm using my phone, so I think it's registered as Tandy. I hope you can hear me. First of all, I'm very grateful.
Are you compliant with data protection?
Yes, I am. I'm very grateful, and thank you, Juliet and Winnie, for your presentation. I also identify with Juliet. We were part of the team that brought you the current Children's Act, serving in the steering committee. So mine is just actually comments, recommendations rather, that we can think of. So one, I want to pick from what Enrica has talked about on the issue of the embassies and all that. And I just wanted to recommend that the issue of the cross-border conversations is actually long overdue. And as we think about that, we also need to think of how we can further influence policies within the region. So we have the regional economic communities, such as the East African Community, ECOWAS, IGAD, and all those. It's a good time for us to map around issues of trafficking and how we can get this enforced in those policies. And then secondly, the issue of interagency prevention and response mechanism, because we seem to be very helpless just from the conversations we've been having on especially holding the government accountable in terms of preventing trafficking for children and also responding to it. I do appreciate the issue of engaging with the court, but I also feel like we need to really have a monitoring framework so that we have specific deliverables on the key government officials who need to take up this issue. Then again, the last thing I'd also just want to raise is on enforcing the current Children's Act, because we actually got to include child trafficking in the act itself, but also considering this as a form of abuse. Then the other thing is the emerging issue on the digital environment and how it relates to trafficking of children, the advancement of technology. That's one of the areas we also need to consider, because trafficking has started taking a very different form in terms of engaging children online and then using that as a platform to now do the physical form of trafficking. Then lastly, for Winnie, thank you for the good job you're doing at heart. There's an opportunity to continue raising awareness. I know we've talked about the children from Tanzania, but something as simple as the young girls and young boys that are sometimes employed to do domestic work, you know, the house girls, the shamba boys and all that. This is a conversation that we really need to find a way to get to the grassroots so that the policies begin to make sense to a kawaida mwananchi on the ground. So maybe as we also have this within our space as the justice actors for children, we also need to think of how we can engage the normal mwananchi. So those are just my comments on the same, and thank you for the good work you're doing. Looking forward to how we can also partner together. I work for Plan International. Thank you.
Thank you. Now the name there is Thandi, and I continue with Thandi because compliance with the data protection, call the person by the name that you see. Mugao Nkada, you are saying that you are the CEO of Florix and Hope Rescue Center. The embassies are very hostile sometimes. And of course, that is true. I can attest to that. Some embassies, of course. I remember 2 years ago when we were dealing with Nepalese, we had even to go to court and obtain orders from the court for the trafficking for the trust fund, actually to release money to pay for the air tickets for this Nepalese to go back. Their embassy actually refused completely to assist in enabling these victims of trafficking back to their country. Of course, we know how they came in, and there are so many stories behind it. We need also maybe Winnie and Ruth, name and shame. Think of name and shame. We know the people who are doing this business. We need to have a forum for name and shame. Some of them are, of course, influential people, but name and shame will make them actually, we can even name and shame through the US embassy, so that they don't say that it is Juliet who has done so, but let's participate in such kind of things so that these people can stop these fights. The other one is relationship between trafficking in persons and drug trafficking. I think this one, Juliet will tackle that one. And also, I want Winnie to talk about the recent example of those people who actually caught a week ago, 2 weeks ago. They were being transported to South Africa from Ethiopia. Winnie, I think you have that case at hand. Maybe you can talk about it briefly and what it portends in the fight against trafficking, and whether that is trafficking, whether it is smuggling, as Enrique has tried to say. And Harun Omariba, most cases, the police officers are not charging most of the cases of trafficking using the counter trafficking in persons. Very true. We have done a lot of trainings, of course, with border management. Is it BMM? Yes, BMM. We have done so many trainings of CIDs, and we have told them how to frame charges. But still, we have an uphill task. I think that is something, again, we need to talk about and tell us why, up to now, 13 years down the line, a police officer cannot draft a charge sheet under the city, cannot identify a crime as committed under counter-trafficking in persons. Those are the teething problems that we are having. As practitioners, tell us, Winnie, where do we come in and help in terms of operationalizing and actualizing this act? Ruth, back to you.
Great, thank you so much. Enrica was my boss, so you see, she's the one who knows issue on human trafficking. I learned what I learned, what I know, quite a lot of it from her, and Honorable Millie. So it's and I think this says this about fighting human trafficking. We all must join in this fight. It cannot be done by one person, and things keep changing. There is a lot that is happening. And we need to keep ourselves, abreast. So I'll start with the first question that Enrica asked, and the question was about the watch list. We are no longer on the watch list. I will tell you the negotiation that went down. I had to go to Washington. When we first, the advisory committee came on board, we went and said, well, listen, we can no longer be on the watch list because of, we are doing certain things that we were also advised. But that also to say, I see the TIP report not necessarily as something for us to worry about, but as an indicator of where we are and where we ought to be going. And we ought to think of also ourselves and asking ourselves as a country and measuring our own steps, so that it's not so much about what the TIP office says. How does Winnie and other NGOs hold even our government accountable? But also, even as NGOs, how do we hold ourselves accountable? As lawyers, how do we hold ourselves accountable? Because as I read the Constitution says that we are all bound by that Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So how do we hold ourselves accountable? And so we're no longer on the watch list. We are just on tier 2. And it means we are making one step ahead and several backwards, but very many good countries are also still on the tier 2. But can we agree also that if we look at the budgetary allocations for how we are dealing with human trafficking, supporting victims. Now, the case that you just gave, for example, the child who you rescued and eventually discovered that child was actually a minor who was a victim of trafficking. Essentially, the Kenyan government ought to come in, support that child, provide for them, and probably take them to school. On an ideal situation, by the way, this is what our law envisions, that the Kenyan government will actually give that child, stay in this country, support them, protect them, and hopefully they grow up to be people who, can fend for themselves and economically even contribute to this country by paying taxes. That is what the law envisions. So on a good day, that is what it looked like. I absolutely agree on surrogacy. I am involved in one or another, and I followed this conversation. So thank you for being there, and hoping that we can keep looking out for safeguards for the child. And I love that you pointed that out, that it's not just about reproductive health rights, it's also about the best interest of the child here. So I totally agree. The conversations with borders, this is, I hope that LSK, can we champion this? The conversations with embassies, the cross-border conversations about protection, not just of victims of trafficking, but many other victims who are victims of migration. Is this something that LSK can do? I think there's space there. And naming and shaming we do through the UPR reports, through the reports that we give to the Human Rights Committee, to the African Charter, the African Committee of Experts, African Commission. We give those reports to them, and that is how the naming and shaming is actually done by NGOs. But I think largely there are three, there are those three, what are they called? Obligations and ways to deal with trafficking. So one is prevention. I think it's a time that we focused on this prevention aspect of it, because we know what to do. We know where the victims lie. We know the vulnerable, what makes people vulnerable to human trafficking. I think we can work on prevention. HART is doing a great job. Love Justice is preventing at the border or trans-border, intercepting trafficking at the border point. I think the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection can focus on the vulnerable victim, because we know the poverty line and where it lies and where the people who are suffering from extreme poverty live. We know what their need is. And if we can use social assistance and social protection to address that, then we are working better and smarter, as opposed to waiting for the police to be able to come and prosecute. So the question from Mariba, oh, that's for Winnie. I'm gonna let her do it. Thank you. I hope I've answered a lot of the questions that have been raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet. Winnie.
Thank you, Judge. I'll build up from where actually Juliet finalized her feedback. And I'm looking into, first of all, the East African community, but also just looking into the neighboring countries. So something has been done so far that I think what we can be able to look into is how we build up on it. So we do have one of the partners under the BMM project, that is GNODC and Civipol, who are able to support the Kenyan government in developing the standard operating procedures, looking into investigation and prosecution of trafficking in persons. And we have the same process which has been done in Uganda, in Ethiopia, in Djibouti. So the neighboring countries already have this process finalized, and they already have the process available. And now we are looking into how do we have SOPs for the region. So when you're doing referrals, and this is also involving the coordinating bodies. For our case is the CTIP, looking into the similar bodies in other countries. How are they coordinating these efforts? And I feel like this will be able to help us to see then how do we increase the prosecution cases. But I think definitely looking at the ESC, looking into how do we actually have proper processes through that body, the EGAD as well. I think that has not been done, but looking into how do we also initiate engagements at that level. The question around the drafting of charges, I think it's something that we were discussing the other day. It's like every organization or body is doing trainings for the same stakeholders. So you'll hear we have trainings ongoing for the Secretariat, looking at border migration, looking into border management, looking into the ODPP, we have trainings, the DCI, the police, we have trainings ongoing throughout. And for sure, we ask the same question, how come we have the same trainings, but nothing is changing? I think it's a question we have to ask ourselves. The prosecutor is not only handling trafficking cases, they have several others actually that come to their desk. This is not their day-to-day work. When it comes to the police, they're managing more cases beyond trafficking cases. So looking into how do we ensure that those of us who are engaging with them, there's continuity in these processes, because if you're only going to offer a training once in a year, or just one training and always saying we did a training for the Busia community, once we have transfers, we have a change of information. It is moving all around. But I think from what I was sharing earlier, just the complexity of the issue of human trafficking, being able to actually prove that there was the activity, there was not the means, and also being able to show the purpose. Unless someone works backwards, it's difficult for us being able to actually prove this and also have evidence that you can actually admit in court. So I think it's us also looking into, as we offer these trainings, are we actually able to go deeper beyond just the definitions? When it comes to investigations, more is required beyond just telling the person there is an activity, there's a means, and there's a purpose. Even looking into even how do we interview upon a rescue? When you've done a raid, how do you even do the interviews, being able to separate victims and the traffickers? Like, there's a lot that needs to get done. And I feel like the SOPs have been able to address that question, because it even provides a checklist. So anyone who is able to use the SOPs, they're able to actually follow through the process when being able to actually identify a victim who has been trafficked. It's only being disseminated now because it was only launched in November last year. So the goal is to see, as we disseminate, is there an improvement, is there a change? But also having to appreciate the fact that investigating these cases actually require more resources that actually sometimes is available to our law enforcement. So also, how do we offer support in those processes? So I'm saying we have problems. For now, we don't have the answers, and the goal is to look into how do we build up on what has been done, and also sometimes at least changing our approaches for this to be achieved. The question, I think the point that was made on prioritizing prosecution and protection. I would say when it comes to now, specifically using the example of the Tanzanian cases. So one of the things is that once you do a rescue, it's not possible for you to repatriate without actually having to go to court, because you require repatriation orders for this to be issued through the courts for you to actually have this possible. So this currently is done, and I think from what I was sharing with the challenges we are facing as CSOs, who sometimes are the ones who get to offer shelter for the people before they're taken back to their countries, is when this process takes a long time, we end up frustrating the survivors who are supposed to be witnesses in these cases, and we end up losing out with some of them choosing to escape from the shelters, others choosing to withdraw their participation in the cases. And it's a question of how do we not prioritize one, but ensure that the two of them are always prioritized. As much as you're looking into prosecution, also being able to prioritize protection of these victims who actually are supporting the prosecution team. And I think just the last point, it's not only Tanzanian children that are trafficked into the country. We do have many Ugandans in the country. We do have many Ethiopians, Eritreans, Nepalese, Indians. We have all types of people being trafficked into the country, but also Kenyans being trafficked into different parts of the world, as well as within the country. And so it's a question of being able to look into how do we holistically look into the issue as we respond, because what has happened, we've prioritized cross-border cases, and those trafficked within the country always end up not being identified and not being able to also receive the right services. And that's when you look into most of our databases, you'll find we are identifying victims who are trafficked across the borders or foreigners trafficked within the country. Why? Looking into the trainings, the media communications is always focusing on those who are trafficked across the borders or those who are trafficked within the country. So it means it's very easy for us to identify these victims, or very easy for this victim to identify themselves as a person who has been trafficked. So they're able to report the case. But that means we are offering support, aligning our policies, our systems based on one area, and this is going to actually haunt us later on, the more you keep on prioritizing cross-border cases. So all of us being able to remind us that actually this happens within the country, as we develop our programming, our approaches, being able to also address what is happening within the country. And I believe I have been able to address most of the questions. I think the last one, George, on the question on those who are intercepted from Ethiopia heading to South Africa, most of the time these cases end up being smuggling cases, because at this point they're just on transit. Nothing has happened to them. We can't prove anything, but then they are vulnerable immigrants at this point. It's a question of how do we address this. As Kenya, we do not have a law looking at an act focusing purely on smuggling. So even how it's addressed, how they're being identified, we have some challenges currently. But this essentially normally is smuggling and it is trafficking. But we also do know of Ethiopians, Eritreans, people from the neighboring countries who've been trafficked into the country. And I hope that addresses the questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Winnie. A lot is coming out from the two of you. Maybe talk about the amendment of the law. There's been proposals. I think during my tenure, there were proposals to amend the law and fill the gaps that are there. How far are we, and where do you think lawyers should come in that amendment, and creating opportunities? Because when we are amending the law, don't sit back as lawyers and wait for that opportunity to come. We have to create opportunities. For example, I think with the chair, there was a proposal that if we could push advisory committee into a directorate, a standalone directorate, so that it can actually have more powers and its own budget to fight this. And that could oversee the NGOs, the way they're running activities and all that. But this one can only be done by lawyers. And even that secretariat, multi-agent secretariat, most of the guys who are coming there are actually, most of them are lawyers. And so we have lawyers, you need to know about this and so that you can participate. So what are the opportunities, Ruth, in terms of the amendment of the law? Where are we, and what's happening? I think Ruth has, okay, Winnie, you can tell us from where you sit, where are we with the amendment of the law, and what do you think should happen to, how do we engage lawyers in this to strengthen that law?
So currently where we are at the bill stage. So we have public participation that is ongoing. I think we should have some gazettements going on this year. So we should be able to hear soon from the AC where we are at. But we've been able to come up with a bill that now it's going out for public participation. And I think looking into where the lawyers can come in, at this stage, I think actively participating when we have the gazettement going on, being able to give input on what more needs to be considered, because we've been able to have different experts and stakeholders being involved in the development or the review, actually, of the act. So looking into how they can now actively participate at this stage before we have a law in place that we feel like does not fully address the gaps that exist.
I think we are coming to an end, and unless Juliet, you have something to say, I want to call in or I rather invite the chair, Nairobi chapter LSK, to give closing remarks. Juliet, you have anything to say before I call the chair to give her closing remarks?
All right. I just want to say thank you, really. And there's a lot I've shared on the chat box as well. So we have a lot of materials there, just from Heart's website and everywhere else. Just read and let's engage. I hope that this is a first of many. As you can see, there are so many facets of human trafficking that we could talk about. So I hope that this is a first of many. So thank you very much.
Asante sana. So Chair, welcome, and give us your closing remarks. But first of all, let me thank you for giving the team an opportunity to actually introduce this new topic to lawyers, and I've given it prominence. Justice Nambuye, Court of Appeal, she's actually very passionate about this. That's what I came to realize. I didn't know, but she has a lot of information. So when you appear before her, when in some of these issues, she has a lot that she can actually teach you. So don't go there thinking that they are green about it. So Chair, karibu sana. You can now give us your closing remarks.
Asante Matase. Let me start by saying thank you very, very much to Juliet and Winnie for this insightful discussion we've had this afternoon. I think some of the thought-provoking ideas or things that we need to consider is also, a lot of the time we think that counter trafficking just relates to human trafficking alone, but it is so connected to so many other areas of law, and we may in one way or another come across it or experience it in other ways. For example, it could be in labor issues, it could be in children matters, it could be in anti-narcotics. So we need to understand this and understand it from the level, even from the level of practice that we undertake ourselves. Whether you're a family lawyer, criminal lawyer, labor lawyer, they're all interconnected. As long as you're dealing with human beings, there's always an element of trafficking. And I specifically like what Winnie said, that we tend to concentrate on cross-border and forget the internal issues that we have. I think just yesterday there was a notice, I think from the police about, so is it DCI, about some hundreds of children who had been found, and families were being called to come and identify them. So it's something we need to consider. It could be in your backyard and you just don't know it. So a child goes missing and you say, huyu alipotea, alitoroka. It affects us. And maybe somebody directly or indirectly who's been affected by this. So it's something that we need to all think about. And I want to say thank you very, very much to Winnie and Juliet for sharing these great insights this afternoon. And thank you, George, because when I first approached George with this idea, I know it's been work in progress. Thank you very much for being open to sharing your knowledge with us, George and Winnie and Juliet, and we really appreciate it. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, before I close, in exactly 7 minutes, I believe our debates will be beginning. And so I invite all of you to also join us on our Facebook page, where we'll be streaming live the JSC and presidential candidate debates, the final submissions by Nairobi branch. Join us, and please look out for any other webinars we may be having next week. I believe next week we have, if I'm not mistaken, 2 webinars. Please join us for those as well. Follow us on our social media handles. Subscribe to the WhatsApp channel. You'll get all the information you need about Nairobi branch, your home. We support you, support us. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, Chair.